to my understanding of the literature, all therapy, like what predicts best the effectiveness of a therapy isn't the precise method that's used.
Therapist.
Yeah, it's the therapist. Like how much does the therapist care? And they essentially do what the parent does to their infant. Like how well are they able to get the mental state of their patient, and how are they able to put order inside of it and express that back to their patient. And that's what's gonna shape the client out of their chaos, really. So it seems like as close to a fact as I can get that love is what makes humans like coherent, like what makes you more of a person, what makes you more rational and so on is ultimately love.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with JP Marceau. Those that followed the channel for a long time have gotten to know him. He's been around from the very beginning. He's taught a class for us. He ran the blog for many years, and he is going to be the very first non-fiction book, and also book not for me, that Symbolic World Press is publishing. We were supposed to publish it in 2024, but with all the chaos of everything that happened with the press, we decided to postpone it a little. But I have in my hand a copy of JP's book. It's really nice. It looks so professional. I'm really proud of the team. It's just how professional it looks. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to connect with JP again and to talk about the book, and obviously to talk about the ideas in the book. So welcome on the channel.
Thanks for having me on again, Jonathan. I'm really happy that the book is almost ready.
You have been the most patient. He's been the most patient of all, because it was supposed to come out like in the fall, even maybe before. And then there were so many things going on, and we were basically putting the foundation for the company, with Richard Rowland obviously at the helm, trying to kind of get things settled. And so now here we are, we're in a good position now. Things are going well. We have a store. We have our other books are available for people to buy. And so it was the perfect time to do this. So pretty happy that we're here. And so the book is called Post-reductionist Christianity, A Way Out of the Meaning Crisis, obviously referring to John Vervaeke, who has a nice blurb on the back of the book as well. And so maybe we could start just with that. How is it, first of all, what do you mean by post-reductionist Christianity? And then how is it a way out of the meaning crisis?
Yeah. So, first point on the post-reductionism bit. It's something that has been coming up in the past, 10, 15 years maybe, of more and more people making the connection between the state of naturalism these days, now that materialism has failed, and more ancient metaphysics, classical metaphysics or Christian metaphysics. There's a few authors, both Christian and non-Christian, who make that point now. And the rough idea is we went on sort of this big tangent for a few centuries in the West, where we tried to reduce things down to matter for a few centuries, and it worked out well enough for a while. We were making enough progress that people sort of kept going on that tangent and kept discovering more stuff that was useful. You could build things, you could explain things, and people progressively became sort of blinded to stuff that didn't fit within that worldview. And at some point, there were too many issues and it ended up imploding. But I'd say in the last few decades, this implosion has become clear enough that, okay, lots of people are looking for alternatives. And one of the things that's happening is that people are looking specifically back to ancient metaphysics or medieval Christian metaphysics. And I explained that in the first part of the book. What are some of the main arguments? I can't go through everything because by now the scholarship, especially in the last, 5 years, 10 years, has become very massive on the failures of materialism. So I can't go through everything. My objective is more to give a few important points for the failures of materialism, and specifically also those that are going to be most helpful to quickly move back to something that used to work, to classical metaphysics, and then specifically Christian metaphysics. So when I talk about post-reductionist Christian metaphysics, I mean the kind of metaphysics that we end up with now that reductionism has failed.
All right, yeah. And I mean, maybe you can help us connect a little bit, you know, in the sense that what is it, like what is it about the post-reductionist systems that connect to the ancient metaphysics? How do they make that connection?
The biggest one is a layered view of nature, I would say. Maybe I can wind the clock back a little bit to when people started to dig more and more into materialism. It's around the scientific revolution, people like Galileo. You can draw the line like with a few different figures. Some people try to bring it back to nominalism too. I like to bring it more to the scientific revolution with people like Galileo, because I think nominalism would largely have stayed like an abstract theory if it hadn't had like the precise backing of one materialistic theory that worked well enough in practice that people could then sort of put aside metaphysical reflection. So anyway, when Galileo proposed materialism, for him it was a conscious lab kind of situation. Like it was not at all trying to reduce everything down to matter. He thought that qualities still exist, but they must exist somehow in minds and not in the external world that you can measure mathematically. Mm-hmm. Which has issues, but at least you can understand why in a, let's say, scientific hypothesis, you could try to make that and see if you're going to reach interesting conclusions. But when Galileo postulated that the external world has no qualities and it only has extension that you can measure, he was able to find out a few physical laws, and progressively people like built upon that and built upon that and built upon that. And the successes in physical science and physical engineering became so great that people tried to use that method for everything. And like the basic view was then, okay, you can have sciences that exist above the level of physics, but really it's all just physics. So like you can study chemistry, but really chemistry is just like applied physics. And you can study biology, but really biology is just like applied chemistry, which is applied physics, and so on for all the sciences. But there have been enough problems now, and let's say there has been lack of progress with that method for the past few decades, and alternative theories have been explored that bear more fruit now, that people no longer try to reduce everything down to the lowest layer. Yeah. So for instance, in psychology and cognitive science, people will talk about the level of the mind without trying to reduce the mind just to neurons. You can find out more interesting stuff and predict more things. Even if you try to build intelligent machines, the way to do it isn't what people used to think, which was to like hard code certain like logic parameters and functions and so on, like, and sort of control everything tied down to like a precise algorithm. What seems to work best is to put your machines in an environment, even if it's a fake environment where you simulate a world, and then have your machine learn through tons and tons and tons of trial and error in that world. So you don't try to reduce sort of the intelligence down to something you can like code precisely here or there. The intelligence is more something that emerges. That's what people would say, between an agent and its environment. Mm-hmm. So what happens with these kinds of moves is that all the layers of the hierarchy become real. They're not just physics, ultimately, let's say. And that can map pretty neatly to ancient metaphysics, where people also considered that there were different layers in the hierarchy. Sometimes in ancient metaphysics, people did the opposite, where like everything that really existed was forms, and like matter was always like decaying, let's say,
illusions or something.
Yeah. But at least in Christian metaphysics, and also in certain strands of Greek philosophy, that's not the case. In Aristotle, arguably, for instance, all the layers of the hierarchy are real, and what you have then is like a very close mapping to what you see in non-reductionist naturalism these days, where it's true that you can talk about the emergence of molecules from atoms, let's say, where you need several atoms to be like interacting together in the right ways for something new to emerge, namely a molecule. But then there will be constraints top-down imposed on the atoms by the molecule. So it's not just emergence bottom-up, it's also emanation top-down. And that's true for all the layers of the hierarchy, which the ancients were comfortable with. They didn't use the modern equivalents, but there have been people now who make the case that you might as well just talk about form and potentiality like the ancients did. So let's say you can say that atoms are potential for molecules, and the form of the molecule can constrain down the atoms, and then you can do that for other layers. So the mapping is pretty direct there.
Yeah, and this is the thing that it was difficult for people to understand, is because we have such a weird way of using the word matter today, which is that we have this, it actually doesn't make any sense anymore. Like we had this idea of just like non-qualified stuff at the bottom that has no qualities, but it turns out that is just impossible. There is no unqualified stuff at the bottom. The more if you move into that layer as low as possible, you just have potential positions. Yeah. And then the notion that Aristotle had of matter was that matter is the thing that constitutes an identity at any level of reality, right? So it's exactly what you said, and it really the idea that also that matter is related to mother in terms of its signification, yeah. And so like you said, the family members are the matter of the family, and then the pages are matters of a book, and so it just depends on what it is, what thing that you're identifying, and what constitutes it.
Yeah, and another place where there's a revival of classical metaphysics is in terms of what we participate in. So vices and virtues, for instance. We also got off on this weird tangent during the Enlightenment, where morality became a thing of abstract rules that you must follow, or things that you must do or avoid. But the ancients had a view where you participate in goodness and you try to avoid participating in evil. So you develop virtues that allow you to better participate in goodness, and you try to avoid vices which make you participate in evil. And this has been coming back also in moral psychology, and that's, I think, a useful for me. I think that was one of the biggest things that helped me then to go practice my way out of the meaning crisis, I would say. When you take into account, I can mention a few things from cognitive science, because I think there's a nice continuum that exists in how we learn to see more and more abstract patterns. So infants can't see when they're born, and it's not just because they don't have all the, let's say, receptors in their eyes. Yeah, everything is chaos at first, and it takes practice before they learn to see faces and objects and pick them up and so on. And even adults, there's a few experiments or situations where people can learn to see with something other than just their eyes. There's people who are blind but who learn to see through echolocation. There's like a few dozen people on Earth who can do this, and for also like anyone can try, if you have the right devices, other ways of seeing. Like there are certain cameras you can put on your head, let's say with a helmet, that you can connect to electrodes to your tongue, and then depending on like the receptors on the camera, it's gonna like tingle your tongue electrically. And if you try to interact with the world this way, over time, it's not that long even, you can start to see things. It's not going to be great resolution, but like people can walk about in a room, they can pick up stuff, and people describe it as seeing the world in bubbles. It's a kind of perception that you learn, and I think it's akin to what happens in infants when they learn to see. And when you notice this in these settings, you can also start to notice it in your own life. It happens fairly often that maybe you're in front of a situation you've never been in before, maybe a sport you don't know, maybe someone that you haven't seen in a long time, but they've changed a little bit. And then when you look at them, you see kind of chaos. Like initially you don't know what you're seeing, but maybe they tell you their name, and then from chaos you switch, and then you see exactly who that person is. So that's relearning to see a person.
That's an amazing experience. I've had that experience a few times, and it was really for me helpful to understand to what extent patterning is part of our perception, because it happened to me once, which was my cousin. I hadn't seen my cousin in a very long time, and my brother Mathieu sent me a video of her, and he said, "Watch the video." And I was watching the video, and I was like, "Why does he want me to watch this stupid video? Like, it's just not interesting." And then I stopped. He said, "Watch the video," and I watched the video. And at some point, her name appeared on the screen, and then her face became my cousin's face, and then I couldn't remember what her face was before. It was like it completely replaced her, and now I could see my cousin. And I thought it was really, for me, an example of exactly what you're saying, which is that that pattern and meaning is inevitable. There is no world without meaning.
This reminds me of an example I had in my own life recently. I've been learning to sing a few Christmas hymns, or Advent hymns, I should say, rather, because it's the season. And my wife is a much better singer than me, so from time to time I'll like try to sing the song to her so she can correct me. And the funny thing is that like recently she pointed out that there was this sequence that I was singing wrong, where I was always singing the same note instead of like slightly going up each note like I'm supposed to, and I had never picked up on it. But like as soon as she said it, and then I re-listened to the song, and then I tried to sing it, and I knew exactly what she was saying. Like I had been wrong for a dozen times I had sung the song, and I just hadn't noticed. So my perception was automatically readjusted, and I'm learning to see music more than I used to. Yeah. And this scales up the hierarchy. It's not just for objects. You learn to see like musical patterns, movement patterns. You eventually learn to see emotions in people. So that's another thing that kids don't know right off the bat. They have to practice. Actually, they need practice even just to order their own emotions. Like infants are just chaotic, like in terms of their emotions. They're not at all ordered in what we recognize as emotion in an adult. But through interactions with their mother, their father, the infant will learn to see other people's emotions. And even adults, like you will also get better at this as you age, as you interact with people. You'll be better able to pick up emotions in the people around you. And eventually you can learn also to notice vices and virtues, which the ancients talked about, and which they had great insights to teach us, like how you can improve those perceptions. And also perceiving narratives. That's something we need to practice. Like infants, again, can't tell narratives. Even like all adults, we still, almost all adults, I think, love stories. People might not notice it as much, but if you go to a movie, you watch Netflix, you read a book or whatever, you're practicing your perception of patterns, and you're much better at this than when you were a teenager, let's say. You can rewatch the same movie you watched when you were 13 years old, and then you notice so many more things than you had picked up on before. And this idea that you need to practice your perception is one of the things that I think distinguishes. So the like classical metaphysicians, Aristotle and Plato, they had a bunch of useful stuff to say to us about how to practice that perception, but they don't have any like physical place where we can go and practice explicitly. Like they can tell us why reading books or going to movies would be helpful. They can tell us why trying to live more virtuously will help us better perceive and act out virtues. But a big advantage of Christianity is you have an explicit place where you're supposed to practice that. And the best story, I think, to understand this is the disciples on the road to Emmaus, because it's exactly that. Like they're speaking to Jesus, but they don't recognize him, so they're not picking up the pattern. And then Jesus tells them how to interpret the scriptures. Like it still doesn't click yet, and then they take the Eucharist, and then at one point it like all the patterns align. They finally see the pattern. They see Christ who's in front of them, and that's what we're doing at church. We're trying to practice our perception of the pattern of patterns, of like the logos that is binding all of patterns together. So I think that's one of the parts of the book that I found most encouraging when I like learned these aspects of the literature. It's normal that Christianity doesn't make sense at first. It's normal that like it will be uncomfortable if you try a new sport at first, you're not going to be good at it. You're not going to pick up the patterns. Like it could take years before you're any good at jiu-jitsu, let's say, and you just like see chaos in front of you. You don't understand what's happening to you. But at some point, if you keep practicing, you start picking up the patterns, you notice them, you start to enjoy it, and it becomes just like one of your virtues, like a good patterns you can pick up on. So I think going to church is a bit like that too. That's an aspect of Christianity that I think we can appreciate today with all of that psychological insight that is out there in the literature.
Yeah, and I think that's really the point, because you see in some ways, you see a lot of return to these ancient ways of thinking. Obviously, Stoicism has become quite popular again, and there's this, and a return to Aristotle or to the ancients. You see it all over the place, but I think there is something about liturgy, and the reality of group participation and coming together and participating in a rhythm. It's like a dance. In the same way that's what a dance is too. Like when you learn to dance with someone, when you see really good dance partners, you realize that they're not thinking about this. They're not thinking it out. They have come to learn to recognize the very subtle signs in their dance partner, and they know what to do. And they both come to communicate in subtle ways to know how to act and how to react to the music and to react to each other's very subtle gestures. And I think that that's the way to understand what going to church is and what liturgy is in some ways you're being formed, at very high levels with music, with glorification, with asking for, contrition, asking for forgiveness, all these things that we're doing. It is in some ways a kind of training for being. And that's why materialists can't understand it, right? That's why they talk about silly hats. You still have the Joe Rogan types who say, why are these people, they wear silly hats and they do these silly things, and all these they can't see what it is that's actually going on.
I mean, if millions of people across thousands of years craft something to like constantly make it better and richer, like it's normal that you won't get it at first. It's just gonna like be very, very foreign. I can't really think of another example of something that like this many people have worked on, so let's say not consistently, but like on such a precise manner. That become so complex. Like it's normal that you won't get it, and it's gonna
because it's a lot. We have a smaller version of that. Obviously, you have things like handshakes. You have things like I've talked about family meals before. I talk about these kinds of interactions that are all little versions of what it is that happens in liturgy. Where when you're learning to shake someone's hand, you're learning to hold someone's hand. Because you can if you remember when you were learning to shake someone's hand when you were like 8, 9, 10 years old, and you realize that if you meet people that shake your hand too tightly or too loosely or keep your hand too long, and you realize the effect that it has on you, it is weird, unsettling effect. And to find that balance is also just finding the balance of social interaction, because usually the person that holds your hand too long during a handshake, they have all kinds of other odd social behaviors that is making it difficult for them to interact positively with others. And so, that's why the difficulty, I think, like you said, with the liturgy and with liturgical practice is that because it's so full, it's more like jiu-jitsu, right? Like you said, it's more like you don't know exactly what it's for until it comes into you, for a very long time. So, I mean, that's why we have saints. Saints are great because saints, in theory, what they're there to do is to make you trust the process. It's like, we have examples of people that have really gone through this and look at what it brought about in their life, and therefore trust the process. You'll get there. You can't just like when you're learning anything at the beginning, you can't think that you're going to master it right at the outset. It's like if I read a physics paper, I have no idea. I'm just reading gibberish. I feel like when I see people like Gad Saad, God bless him. When he talks about postmodernism, for example, and he says it's just gibberish. Or when I see people on my videos, they say, oh, it's just word salad. It's like, if I read a math paper and I've never studied math, it's all word salad. It's all just a bunch of lines on a paper. You have to trust the process and enter in order to learn what it's doing. Yeah,
I think this is one aspect of Christianity, I think, that we can appreciate more now within the post-reductionist context. I think if you read the ancients, it's obvious that they had at least an implicit understanding of how you practice, how what you practice in one domain will transfer to other levels. But I think now with cognitive science, it's super explicit that you can notice how if you practice this thing in the liturgy, it's going to transfer to this way when you have a family meal, for instance. You can understand why when a child learns to do this or that thing, it's going to have a direct impact when they grow up to do this or that thing. So symbolism isn't just about how we make sense, let's say, of the liturgy within itself or the Bible within itself. It's also how, like, when we learn to better perceive and act within those patterns, within those liturgical or religious contexts, then it transforms us and applies to how we interact with those symbols outside of that liturgical context as well. And that's becoming very explicit. Like in the cognitive science of wisdom that's been blowing up in the past, 10, 20 years, makes us appreciate aspects of Christianity that I think weren't as clear for the ancients.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Richard Rowland, and I am interrupting the construction of the new Symbolic World Barn of Podcasting to tell you about a new course that is coming from the Symbolic World beginning February the 24th. This course is called Tolkien and Universal History. So there's a famous letter that Tolkien wrote. It's about 10,000 words or so to a man named Milton Waldman. Sometimes it's called the Waldman Letter or Letter 131. And in it, he says this, speaking of his efforts to create the legendarium. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. Later, he says, I would draw some of the great tales in fullness and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole and yet leave scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. So this course will begin with an exploration of two medieval literary genres, the epic poem and the chronicle, and see how Tolkien used them in his early conceptions of Arda. These two genres of literature are essential to medieval universal history, but of course, as you all know, they're often overlooked as being boring by modern readers, so it's easy to overlook their importance to Tolkien's project. Then we're going to move on to the linguistic and philological framework for Tolkien's legendarium, which shows us how his quote-unquote secret vice is the key to Middle-earth's deep sense of place and time. As surprising as it might seem, it's also the in, you could say, for Tolkien to connect his legendarium to the Christian story. And finally, we're going to look at how he takes all of these elements of universal history and works them into the modern genre of the novel. So it's been said that the only honest response to a work of art is another work of art, and that's something I really believe. So in our final lesson in the course, we're going to do a couple of things. One is we're going to look at the application of the genres and methods that we find in Tolkien to the mythopoeic and universal history efforts of three contemporary fantasy writers, including one, Jonathan Pageau. And there's also going to be a little optional writing assignment for those who want to participate in some mythopoeic efforts of their own. I'm really excited about this course. I know that I've done a lot around the internet about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. This is completely new material, and I'm very excited about it. So I hope you will consider joining me February the 24th. You can learn more by going to thesymbolicworld.com/courses, and I hope to see you there.
You know, it's interesting because there are people, let's say, that do kind of typological interpretation or that do this interbiblical interpretation, that the type of thing that I do or that Mathieu does or that people in the symbolic world do. But there aren't that many places where it's applied directly to every aspect of reality, right? It's like, no, this isn't just a literary structure. This is actually describing a pattern of reality. And I think that, you know, that is also part of this idea that once you see once you not just see in terms of mental, but once you enter into the pattern and you kind of know the pattern, then you can see it in everywhere. Like it just appears, right? And even though others can't see it, it's just the same as seeing a face or not seeing a face, right? It's like once you see it, you just see it. It just lays itself out. I think it's interesting because one of the things, when this whole kind of return to Christianity started, back in 2016, 2017, it was interesting. Some of the very first people that would reach out to me that were converting and that I met were people who were in music, were musicians, especially people that kind of study classical music. It's as if there was something about it. For the ancients, music was one of the main things you had to learn as a human. And what it wasn't just obviously learning the sounds, but it was about understanding that the world is patterned, and that, and it's not just a pattern that's in your mind, it's a pattern that you dance to and that you enter into.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we know now that there's lots of things that you will learn easier if you learn music. I haven't thought about symbolism explicitly, but I know, for instance, that if you learn music, you're going to be better at math because you're learning how to better handle abstract patterns. It applies to music, but probably applies to like narratives and math and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, and I'm a weird exception because I don't understand. I understand music very, very informally. I don't feel like I have a grasp of music, and nonetheless, obviously I can see not all of it, but I can see these symbolic patterns. I always wish that I had the same with math. Like my brother Mathieu because I hated math. I hated math in high school. It was the only class that I failed in my entire life. Was my last graduating kind of honors math class that I had to take because I thought I was going to go into psychology, and then I failed that almost as out of spite for the whole system. And then Mathieu would always say, you need to study math. You'll love it, later, like more higher forms of math. But I couldn't get myself to do it. Couldn't get myself to do it.
Does Mathieu get music? Like, is he more of a...
Yeah, I think so. He studied, when he was young, he didn't study music per se, but he did these weird things. Like, for example, like he would just learn a Bach fugue on the piano, and he would just learn to play it and memorize it. And then he would just play these fugues, but he didn't take classes or anything. And so I think he probably does have a better kind of intuitive understanding of music than I do.
It's interesting. I'll need to think more about that one. I do know many people who picked up on symbolism, let's say, quickly, who were involved in music, but also just visual arts, like in general, like lots of artists.
Yeah, that's probably where mine comes from, because music isn't just music. I think the ancients understood music more generally, just as pattern recognition, like pattern participation. And so I think you're right that if you can recognize, you understand when you study visual art, you understand that an image has to have a limit. It has a frame, it has an inside and an outside. And in order to render the inside, you have to organize the elements in a hierarchy. And you also have to make decisions about what to emphasize and what not to emphasize. And if you're smart, you realize that actually that's how perception works, that it's not just about making a painting, it's actually how all perception functions that way. And for me, that was definitely a huge realization, is to understand that every time you look at something, you're making a painting. You're foregrounding, backgrounding, you're doing all these things, and you're organizing your perceptual field in a structure. And that's why like all my symbolism is geometric. Like most of the symbolism I use is space and that, because that's how I think way more than time.
Yeah, I'm also an exception on this because I never dug that deep into any art form before symbolism, and even now with symbolism, I mostly go to church, and otherwise, and I meditate on scripture, but otherwise I'm almost not exposed to any story. I listen to music sometimes, and I sing when I'm at church, but outside of church, I guess I don't get that much exposure to art these days. But it's probably one of the reasons why it's like I was so meticulous in making the arguments for symbolism, because I came to it more from a technical standpoint. Like I had technical problems to address that I could tell my reductionistic education hadn't prepared me for, and I was looking for alternatives, and I found that the ancients had great solutions to those problems. And then slowly made my way to understand what you were talking about. But and on that front, I can talk about another aspect of post-reductionist Christianity that I think is like something we can appreciate that I don't think the ancients could have picked up on, or maybe they did, but in not as explicit a way, which is it's a new problem that came up because of reductionism, It's called the intrinsic nature of physical entities. People have been observing, including Bertrand Russell, of all people, who was actually a neutral monist, wasn't a materialist, but he observed that, and other people had made the point around him, but he's an important figure with that any physical entity that you describe with physical science is only known externally. You know how the thing behaves, but you're never told what the thing intrinsically is. So, classic example, you take an electron. We know very well how electrons behave in physics. We have equations that work with astounding accuracy. And we know that the electron has this mass or this charge, but really all of what is saying is that if you plug this value as a charge and this value as a mass, and you plug it into all those other equations, you can get all of those quantitative outcomes, but all of that amounts to is still just relations. You know how electrons behave with other things, but you have no idea what the electron really is. And within the physicalist or materialist worldview, this has been sort of a growing problem. It was one thing, I guess, when you just have a few things in your ontology that are materialistic, that follow physical laws, but we've just been growing progressively the amount of things that we say are just physical in the world. Galileo maintained lots of things were not physical, but over time people sort of forgot his hypothesis and try to turn everything into physics.
Yeah, into physical extent. Things that have a measure and extension, and yeah.
But what ended up happening, funny enough, is they made the world empty because they were never able to answer what those physical things are within themselves. What is it that breathes fire into the equations, to reuse a sentence from Stephen Hawking? Mm-hmm. So it's funny. Now, let's say, as I said earlier, people no longer try to reduce everything down to physics, but they maintain that there are all of those layers, but you're still left with the problem that, okay, now what's really at those layers?
What constitutes the layers?
Yeah, and it's funny too, because I think the Christian metaphysicians have been able to answer this, but if you look just at the classical tradition, I feel like they never completely answered this question. They can say that everything is a union of matter and form, but it's still leaves a void. Okay, so what is matter? What are forms? Why do they match? Why is the world sort of built this way? So this remained a puzzle if you stay in classical metaphysics. But in Christian metaphysics, and even before I talk about Christian metaphysics, I can talk a little bit about Panpsychism, because this problem of the intrinsic nature of physical entities is one of the reasons why people have been pushing Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that everything has a mind at some level. Panpsychists today, they wouldn't say that everything at every layer has a mind. The table in front of me, most Panpsychists wouldn't say that it has a mind, but they would say that, let's say it's electrons and molecules maybe have minds, very simple minds, but they have some kind of mind. And the reason why they do this is to fix the problem I mentioned earlier of the intrinsic nature of things. One physical thing in the world that we have intrinsic access to is ourselves. If I go to if I wake up today and at some point I go in front of my computer to talk to you, Jonathan, to promote my book, I have intrinsic access to what is going there. Maybe a physicist could have a very complex equation to describe JP today and why I move this way or that way. Maybe it would be probabilistic, whatever, some very complex physical equation. But still, even if that worked in theory, it wouldn't give me the real reason why I'm moving in this direction, the purpose of me talking to you, promoting my book, and that exists at the level of my consciousness, of my mind. So the move that panpsychists can make, that is pretty elegant, is to say that, well, then the intrinsic nature of the physical entity that I am is my mind. And then it's very elegant. They just say that this is the same thing at every layer of the hierarchy. Every layer of the hierarchy that really exists, that isn't just an accident. The table in front of me, for instance, is arguably just a collection of molecules of the table, in a way that I'm not. I'm not just a collection of molecules. There's a bunch of stuff that you could never explain if you just looked at me in terms of my molecules. But panpsychists will say anytime you are at a layer of reality that is not reducible to what is below, then you're dealing with a mind. And so it puts meaning back into the world because you put mind like in lots of places in the world. So I think it's existentially attractive as an option. It's one of the reasons why people have been drawn to it in the past few decades. And it also solves the problem of the intrinsic nature of physical entities, because now you have a candidate. Like it's like the way I've seen some people describe it is, if you look at just physics, you have a bunch of holes. Like you have a hole in your ontology. And if you look at the mind, you have something that people haven't been able to fit into the world. So you could just put consciousness into the holes that physics gives you. And that's the move. But there are a few problems with panpsychism. It doesn't seem to be a stable position, by the way. What I've seen, interestingly, is most people who are drawn to panpsychism have some kind of background in math or physics. I think you have to really like love that world of equations to like take it seriously. Like you have to take those layers of equations seriously to be interested in panpsychism, because most of the famous panpsychists of the past century have been mathematicians or physicists. Like David Chalmers, one of the big figures in philosophy of mind these days, who champions panpsychism, did his first degree in mathematics. You have also Henry Bergson was a panpsychist about a century ago, and he also had a background in math before he went in philosophy. Our friend North Whitehead, very famous mathematician before he became a very famous philosopher. So anyway, people who are drawn to that mathematicized world would be interested, I think, by panpsychism, because it re-enchants their mathematicized world really quickly. You get to keep all of your mathematical world, but you put consciousness inside of it, so you fit inside of it. There's meaning around you, and so on. So that's why people have been making this move. And if you just stay at the level of classical metaphysics, you don't have a like quick answer, I think, to that. You can say that everything is a union of matter and form, but could every union of matter and form be mind? It's not clear that you have to say no to that and what you replace it with. But there are problems with panpsychism. For instance, it's not clear how, if you just put people together, there will be a compound mind that's gonna appear. It's
like, even in terms of the mind seems to be more than the parts.
Yeah.
Right. It's like there is a kind of top-down constraint, and you see that in humans. You can actually notice that because you have sub-personalities. You can see them, and then there's a kind of top-down personality that constrains, and you cannot explain the top-down personality as just the accumulation of all the lower, let's say, forms of mind or consciousness that you can encounter in the person.
Yeah. Especially when you stay close to the human level, it seems we can notice that we have subpersonalities that are sort of fighting and combining, and sometimes one takes the advantage and so on. And kind of we have like that for a group. But to call that consciousness in the same way that we talk about human consciousness is arguably stretching the concept and making it a bit too vacuous. So people have been looking for alternatives, and also if you take seriously the point that patterns exist and that matter exists, like potential exists, like they don't seem to fit into that panpsychist world either. Like what's the Pythagorean theorem if you're a panpsychist? Like it doesn't seem like it has calling the Pythagorean theorem conscious in the same way that I'm conscious is a bit like, I don't think that works. Like maybe you can vaguely say that it's a kind of spirit or angel in the fact that it's invisible, it exists, it has an impact on reality, but it doesn't have like a temporally extended perception of things in the same way that I have. So it would be strange to stretch the concept. And even worse if you talk about potential, like if you think that potential is conscious, I don't think that quite works. But the Christian answer, and you can find it explicitly. Well, no, not in the modern terms I've been talking about, but you can find that solution in, I think it's very clear in Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, in the Divine Names, I think the fourth section on love. He says that every layer of the hierarchy is love. You can understand everything that's, let's say, below, that's potential for what is above, as a kind of feminine emerging love that's welcoming, that's hosting what comes from above. You can talk about the emanating love from the higher layers as a kind of sacrifice that they're doing for the lower layers to bring them up into higher participation. And every time you have a communion of matter and form, that's a communion in love. So you can explain the intrinsic nature of things as love in a way that doesn't have the same issues that you have in consciousness, because love scales much more easily than consciousness. It's intuitively, you can understand why you would say that, let's say, atoms, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but intuitively it can make sense that atoms are going to love each other in a certain way to create a molecule. Yeah. And the form of the molecule is also exerting kind of care, kind of love around those atoms to keep them together. And they're not going to love some other things like, I know.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good way of thinking about it. There's a kind of jealousy, like a proper jealousy in the sense that the constraint that comes from participating in identity actually holds, right? And it's a magnet in the sense that it holds the form. Obviously there's a limit to how much it holds, but there is for certainly a type of holding that happens.
Yeah, so I think it's good because you get to, someone who loves physics and math like me, you get to keep your hierarchy that you can describe pretty well with the language of physics. It's open to revision, of course, but that's normal with science. But you get to fill it up with meaning by understanding that all the layers really are based on love, top down, bottom up, and also in their connection. That's something you could get from Dionysius, but now it's a lot more precise. You get to explain lots of stuff in the hierarchy. We know more, let's say, how the love is exerting itself in the world, connecting these different things, how different layers give themselves to one another to create all the things that we know around us. So that's a way in which post-reductionism allows us to understand some Christian truths in a novel way.
Yeah, and it's also, it really is, I think that love, like you said, it also then moves into the realm of care, right? It moves into the realm of care in the sense that it also then bleeds easily into the cognitive aspect of what it is we're talking about, which is also the way in which attention functions and the way in which attention, helps or participates in the binding of beings. And so if you pay attention, you can see how you can apply the notion of love to the being itself that you're noticing, but you can also apply the notion of love to the relationship between the being and the measurer, the perceiver, who then sees the being, and that communion is what makes it exist. In the same way that the communion, between the identity or the patterning and the elements makes it exist. Understanding, obviously, that doesn't come from me either, and that my care is also a relationship of love with things that are beyond me, whether it's virtues and ultimately with God. And so, I obviously agree. I'm preaching to the choir here, like with saying that to you, but I think that what I found, maybe you can say what you want because you found your own strategy in the book, is what I found is that one of the problems is when you use the word love, mm-hmm. There are so many hippie and sentimentalism and stuff. Even René Guénon, who I admire, didn't like Christianity because he said it's sentimental, like it's basically affection. And he couldn't see the metaphysics of love. Like for them, it was a non-metaphysical thing. It was basically at the level of human affection and everything. And so how do we communicate that across the fields? Do you think maybe the question I should ask is, do you think that now is easier to communicate that to people than it was maybe even 50 years ago?
I hope so. I think people are more open. I think the problem of the intrinsic nature of things, I think, is more prominent.
It's more acute. Yeah.
I think it's more acute. I think also one of the ways that you can go at it more slowly, let's say, is you can still talk about like consciousness first as a candidate for the intrinsic nature of things for your metaphysics, but then you have to move on to care. So maybe you talk about care rather than love. I don't know how that would work in French, but in English at least you can talk about care, and you can like specify that within consciousness there's a specific role that attention plays that is more primordial than like other aspects of consciousness that wouldn't fit as well with like everything outside. But the idea that all things have a kind of care for others, that's another way of talking about love, as you said earlier. That's not as threatening to people.
Yeah, maybe.
And also, I think it's like a slower step for people who are coming from something like Panpsychism. People who are trying to put mind back into the world. Like it's normal that a first attempt at something that's not materialism is going to be a bit rough. I think what I've seen is that most people tend to move out of Panpsychism after a while because it's not a super stable position. It's a great first step, but it leaves you, I think, with too many open puzzles, and there are pretty good options out there outside of Panpsychism. So I found that most people will move out of it, but it's still starting with the mind and then talking about care within the mind can bring people to a metaphysics of love. But I think you're right that for most people, if you talk too fast about a metaphysics of love, I don't think it's gonna work. As you said, it's gonna be too sentimental. An image I like though is the mother and the child from Balthazar. I think it can also be useful now because we know much more about child development than at least we have heard from the ancients. But for instance, we know that when infants interact with their mother or father, the infant is sort of going to project chaos on their parent. Like their emotions, their care isn't properly like aligned and coherent yet. So they project that to their parent, and then the parent is going to absorb that, is going to put a bit of order inside of it, express that back visually through words, through touch, and so on. And then the child is going to receive that back, and that's going to shape him a little. So he's going to be a little bit more aligned in his emotions, in his care, and so on. And progressively, that's going to mold the child into what we would call more as a coherent consciousness, much less chaotic. So you can say that the mind, the consciousness, the attention of the infant is being brought up, being shaped by the sacrifice of care that the parent is doing. So it's really the love of the parent that is making the infant into a human. And it's the love that the infant still has as this stage for their parent that is pulling them upwards. Like the infant has to love his parent to go through that process and become a person. So I think it's a great thing.
Because we do have examples, obviously, of the feral children where they never, even as adults, even though they're brought back into the human society as adults, they can never become fully human, at least in the way that we understand it, because they missed that relationship of hierarchy. They couldn't be brought up by the angels, like they couldn't be brought into that participation. That's a great example. Yeah, wonderful.
And in psychology these days, like there have been, it's super interesting as people became secularized and they wouldn't get their spiritual help from spiritual elders. People moved to see psychologists, but a bunch of different therapy schools have developed, and I mean they all did their thing for a while, and now we have studies on which kind of therapies work. And to my understanding of the literature, all therapy, like what predicts best the effectiveness of a therapy isn't the precise method that's used.
Therapist.
Yeah, it's the therapist. Like how much does the therapist care? And they essentially do what the parent does to their infant. Like how well are they able to get the mental state of their patient, and how are they able to put order inside of it and express that back to their patient. And that's what's gonna shape the client out of their chaos, really. So it seems like as close to a fact as I can get that love is what makes humans like coherent, like what makes you more of a person, what makes you more rational and so on is ultimately love. So although I wouldn't like go like super fast into telling people that ultimately everything is love, because they're just gonna think it's some sort of hippie hallmark card, but like if you look at the psychology, if you look at the problems we have in physics, if you look at infant development, I think that's going to be the natural conclusion. And it solves so many philosophical issues that I haven't mentioned here. Like how is it that the world exists? Like why is it that there's a world that's distinct from God? Like if you don't have the solution that God created a world that's different from him, but that would grow to resemble himself out of love, I don't know how you can square that puzzle. That's a big puzzle in
without that, you end up with levels of illusion. You end up with a kind of Gnostic hierarchy of illusions, and you end up with things like caste systems, and the notion that it's all Maya, right? That everything is just levels of Maya, and we have to escape, right? This idea that you have to escape the world, which is what you see, in different some strands of kind of East Asian philosophy, and so. For sure, that is something that I think as Christians we have to be able to communicate more clearly to people, the difference, the metaphysical difference between. I tried to do that recently with Kurt Jemungel, on Theories of Everything, this idea that the non-duality of Christianity is somewhat different because it is that it's a non-duality with duality inside it. It's like, God creates out of love in order to bring creation back to himself, but to maintain the distinction, right? Not to fuse everything together. And that is really love. And without it, it's hard to explain multiplicity.
Yeah. I think without that, you fall into like either the extreme you mentioned of emanationism, where the further you get away from God, you just fall into illusion, or you have the idea that the world is independent from God totally. And then pretty quickly, what you're going to end up with that is materialism, because you don't like, if the world exists without God, you just don't need God, and you're gonna forget him. But that doesn't work, like, for all kinds of philosophical reasons. So the really the best analogy I've ever heard to understand why the world can exist is again the mother and child analogy that Balthasar gave, and you can find that insight in it's pretty clear in Dionysius, that it's in the same way that a mother wants their child to grow up and be independent. God wants the world to grow back and be independent. But it's by being an independent person that the child is going to grow into the likeness of his mother. Like if the child always remained like under the care of his mother and never was able to grow up and become independent, he would never actually be able to love his mother and become as close to her as if he grew to be independent and then return that love as a full-grown human. So I think God wants the same thing for the world. He wants the world to be like independent from him, but to return freely in love to him. So that explains like why the world exists, why the world would be so like sometimes distinct from God, why there would be so much problems, so much evil in the world still. But like it's better than having no world, or just having a world that's like materialism and decaying into nothingness.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a big question for you. This is something that I see in the comments all the time. In my comments, people say, Jonathan, why don't you talk about the wave particle distinction? Why don't you talk about the double slit experiment? And I have a hesitation to do so. I think first of all, because I'm not a scientist, that's one of the reasons why I don't talk about it. Second of all, it's because I see so many people use that example to go straight into whatever woo they're interested in, right? It's like, so they use that, whatever woo they're interested in, whether it's be like healing crystals or all kinds of stuff, they use that to go straight there. Like you see, I have all these quantum self-help books, that came out in the 2000s that were just, unbearable. But I want to ask you the question, do you nonetheless, do you think that there is something in that experiment and there's something in that discovery that is nonetheless fueling aspects of this non-reductionist moment that we're in?
I think yes. I think the extent to which you take it depends on the kinds of arguments you want to make exactly. I think at the minimum, it's a good argument against materialism, because what the materialists were hoping to get was that, okay, you just try to reduce everything down to the lowest layers, and always what you're gonna find are stable particles that you can predict deterministically what are gonna happen. And it worked for a while. I mean, for a while, physicists from Galileo down until the early 20th century, they could always find smaller things, more subtle forces or whatever, but it was always something you could quantify deterministically. And by always going lower and lower, you would be able to predict more and more stuff and build more and more powerful machines and whatever. So it seemed like the strategy of looking for smaller deterministic stuff was working, but for the past century, it hasn't been working. It was a shock to many people in physics that you wound up with probabilistic entities at the lowest layer. Some people, by the way, pretty quickly went back to ancient metaphysics. I think it's Heisenberg himself who wrote papers where he defends essentially Aristotelianism. He understands that what you're getting at the lowest layer is what Aristotle predicted. You're getting potentiality. And it makes sense. If there's change in the world, it makes sense that there is the lowest expression of that is just pure change, that is pure potential to grow into anything. So philosophically, Aristotle had predicted that, and Heisenberg wasn't surprised, as many of his colleagues, that what you found at the lowest layer wasn't stable particles at all. So people have been trying, there's lots of debates in the philosophy of physics. For a while, people didn't even talk about it, so because they didn't know how they would fix the problems. People are talking more about that now in the philosophy of physics, because physics hasn't been progressing as fast as it had until, 50 50, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So people are trying to dig more into the philosophy of physics and explore alternatives. But at the very least, what we can say is like any kind of determinism that would support materialism is very hard to defend now in fundamental physics. There are still people who hold on to the possibility that maybe there's a way to get determinism working there, but it would be very difficult to do. You have to resort to theories that are a bit too fantastical. Like by any sort of reasonable reading of the experience you get there are genuine probabilities there, so genuine potential. So then where you take that, I've seen two ways of doing it. One that's more like of a careful and quick return back to classical metaphysics, which is more what I do. Like in the book, for instance, I don't draw quick connections between, or I don't draw quick conclusions, let's say, from the potentiality at the bottom layer of physics and let's say how things exist through human consciousness. I don't do that because I think there are too many debates right now in philosophy of physics to be super confident that you can have a straightforward answer. Maybe we're going to get more of a straightforward conclusion in the following decades if more physicists like actually do philosophy of physics. But it is also possible. I've seen people move on to, I would say, idealistic positions or phenomenological positions pretty quickly of saying that, okay, it's really human consciousness that has a role in collapsing the wave function. That has a role, let's say, to put it otherwise, in collapsing probability waves into actuality. And it's possible. Like the human mind might be that kind of mediator between potentiality and patterns that actually does collapse things around us. It's not impossible. It's just that I wouldn't go there right away for my part, because I think there are too many debates in the philosophy of physics. I think if you add many independent arguments that something like that is happening, then physics would be corroborating evidence, let's say, like you would be able to explain it. But a more careful path, which is what I'm doing, is just saying, okay, clearly materialism is false. We need something else. It seems like Aristotle and classical metaphysicians in general add a better explanation for what's happening. So I just go there. Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, if I make my way to the metaphysics of love that we discussed earlier, that's how I see more the existence of the world happening through human consciousness. I would say more specifically through human love, and specifically the love of Christ on the cross. I think that's what creates the world. So that's more how I would make my way to explaining how human consciousness has a role in creating the world. I wouldn't go straight from physics to that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And in some ways it reflects the way that I've treated this, by not talking about it. What for sure, when I look at it in terms of an analogy, if I look at the idea of collapsing a wave into a particle, with the tension, in terms of analogy, my first reaction is to say that happens all the time. And everything you look at, that's what happens. That is, the field of possible identities that is in front of you, it's always collapsed into centers, like into things that you can grasp. That is like a point, right? Like it always happens. Every time you do something, because everything has an indefinite amount of possible reasons why you would notice it, or why they would have identities. And so, at least in terms of an analogy, it seems to me that it makes sense. But I also, in the same way you do, I usually don't talk about that, because I feel like maybe you formulated it the right way. It's too much of a jump. Like it's almost, because that wave collapse, the collapsing of the wave into a particle, it's like a technical thing, and whereas we're talking about how meaning layers at every single level. So maybe it's true, but we have to be cautious not to confuse some kind of technical thing of measurement, because in some way that's what we're trying not to do.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It's also because maybe that's what it is, and it's the reason why sometimes I hesitate with McGilchrist. Although I like him, I think there might be a performative contradiction sometimes in talking about left brain, right brain, when in fact you're talking about human experience. So nobody experiences their brain, and so this idea of like, we found this technical proof at the bottom of reality. It's like it's a technical thing that describes the question of attention. It's like I'm suspicious of that because that's actually what we're moving away from.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Like it's normal that symbolism you've used many times, but it's normal that if you keep like looking down lower and lower into potential, at some point you're gonna find a kind of mirror that's gonna bring you back up, like all the way on the other side. So, and it's not necessarily bad. I think people going from materialism to idealism is at least a good first step. But like you don't want to get stuck into those extremes. Like giving so much value to physics that you wind up with a kind of idealism at the same time, and you try to live with both. I think that's not a stable position. I think what I've seen in general is people who like notice the issues with materialism and reductionism, they move on to something else quickly, like idealism or panpsychism, but that's also not a super stable position. So then they will make their way back to something more like the ancients. I think because those extremes were explored by the ancients anyway, like Aristotle and Plato, they dealt with those kinds of problems. It's just that if we moderns try to read Plato and Aristotle straight away, it's probably too big of a jump for us. But if you learn, materialism doesn't quite work. What else is there? And then you learn to see that there are other positions like idealism and panpsychism. Then you're a bit better able to understand what the ancients meant by form, by potential, and so on. And at some point, the positions of the ancients become just more more intelligible and more attractive. And if you couple that with the fact that like there's no church where you'll go to be a panpsychist or an idealist. Like if you want to actually like practice your way out of your materialism, I don't know of a good alternative.
Yeah, there's no
outside of the church.
There's no better alternative. And it's so weird. I really remember. I remember learning about Plato and Aristotle in Cégep, like when we learned here first philosophy classes. And I was 17, but I clearly remember now that I understand these things better, that the teacher had no idea what the hell he was talking about. That he really didn't know what forms were. He didn't understand what an unmoving mover is. He didn't understand any of, like, none of it. He didn't know what potential was, didn't know what actuality was, none of it. Like, he just didn't know. He just saw this weird, like, strange system that these ancient, superstitious people had. And, thank God we have science now. And it was like, he was the one teaching us this stuff. And so hopefully that these changes in our world will bring about a whole new generation of teachers that will actually be able to help, young people understand these things.
I think so. I think it's happening.
Yeah. And so everybody, this book, look at this book, right? In this book, you basically have the argument. And so, I love Jordan Peterson, but his book, Wrestling with God, is 600 something pages long. This book is like 160 pages long. And you have a beautiful argument for non-reductionist materialism, post-reductionist materialism, for all your engineer bros and all the people around you that don't know why you're interested in symbolism. This is a great place to go. So go ahead, you can go to thesymbolicworld.com. You find links to it, and we'll have all kinds of places where we're selling it. We'll put the links in the description. And Jean-Philippe, thanks for writing this for us.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thanks for all the years that you've been answering my questions and supporting me to write articles for you, videos for you, and then that book. I'm very happy and thankful.
All right.